Good morning. Welcome back to another episode of the Red Chip Poker Podcast. I'm your host, James SplitSuit Sweeney, and today we're going to talk about exploitative poker. Now, I know we've been talking about GTO a tremendous amount over the last couple of years, and really poker training as a whole has really shifted over to largely focusing on GTO strategies and simplifications and all the fun stuff that comes from kind of solver land. But exploitative poker is still the name of the game, especially when you're playing in games that have softer opponents. Getting focused on exploitative poker is going to be way more lucrative than just trying to adhere strictly to what the GTO solver would do in a situation. So we really don't want to abandon exploitative poker just because GTO is something that everyone is kind of studying and looking at and really excited about right this moment. So what I want to do is go through some questions that were recently asked on the Red Chip Poker Discord. You could always join for free today, redchippoker.com/discord. Join for free, ask questions like this or about anything you want, post hands, whatever, talk with a community of players that love poker as much as you do. It's a really excellent place. But a couple of good questions were raised there recently talking about exploitative poker and how to really think about it. So without further ado, let's jump right into it and get into some of these questions. Alright, so this first one comes from Louis Q, who asked the following. Question about exploits. Most videos I see about exploits are focused on postflop. Would you typically advise someone to stick with the pro preflop ranges and then focus their exploits on the postflop side? If that's not the case, how much do you tend to deviate? For example, if you think someone is pretty value heavy on their 3-bets, do you tend to be a couple of hands tighter or massively change your range? So this is a great question, and honestly we should be looking to exploit hard both preflop and postflop. Now, you mentioned preflop ranges, and just like anything, there are defaults in this game that we use to try to simplify things and make life a little bit easier, take out some of the guesswork and give a good starting point. Preflop ranges are no different. They're a good preflop starting guide, get you in the right ballpark. Might not be perfect, definitely not going to be exploitatively perfect, but it gets you in the ballpark and it simplifies your life a little bit. Same thing with general default postflop lines or postflop bet sizing, stuff like that. So there are defaults there that keep you in the right line, but they're probably not perfect nor exploitatively perfect. But again, if you use them as a starting guide, that's a good way of thinking about them. Now, as to the training comment, it definitely sometimes appears like there is a lot more postflop exploit being explored in videos. And this is simply a byproduct of the fact that the closer and closer you get to the river, the easier and easier it is to actually calculate the exploit and what is the best possible line available. Right? When you're on the river, there's only so many actions left to take, and as such, it's pretty simple to calculate the best exploit. Whereas if you're on the turn, you have to account for all possible river actions, all possible reactions to your turn actions, etc., and back that up even further. If you're on the flop, then you have to have to calculate for things like all possible turns and rivers. That can get quite taxing, very tricky, and just mistakes can definitely be made there. So as you get closer to the river, it's definitely far simpler to calculate the best exploit. Whereas if you back that up even one step further and try to get to preflop, I mean, it's extremely complicated. So when you're looking for like the most refined calculated exploits, those are mostly going to be later in the hand as you are nearing river and nearing showdown possibly. Now, that all being said, there are some exceptions to this when it comes to preflop especially, and let's just take an example where someone is folding too often preflop, right? Clearly just their folding frequency is too high. And for what it's worth, I know I've talked about this in the past, and this is an area where things have changed a lot as the game continues to mature and evolve. There used to be lots and lots of players that would fold way too often preflop, their folding frequencies were far too high, but as the game continues to mature and evolve, that's just not the case as often. It's harder to find players that will overfold in spots. That being said, though, they're certainly still there, so don't stop looking for them. Just know that this isn't like going to happen probably 50 times a session like it used to maybe 5-something years ago. So if you take a situation where someone is overfolding preflop, say they're just folding way too often against steals, like it's pretty easy to calculate and exploit accordingly, right? You're just looking for a steal situation. You're like, okay, they're probably going to overfold here. And as such, what do? You just start stealing with pretty much anything because they're overfolding either way. And as such, it's very easy. When they continue, you tighten back up postflop a little bit because they tend to have a stronger range when they continue, and you just make very easy decisions from there. So when you find situations where players overfold, and you could use this exact same thing post-flop, right? Players that are overfolding against c-bets on whatever texture or in whatever situation, look for situations like that. Again, they may not come up a ton, but those are very, very easy spots to find exploits and just be able to say, okay, I can probably expand my range quite a bit or even a tremendous amount, again, based upon them overfolding in a given spot. But the issue is that as soon as we step away from someone overfolding and they start maybe, I don't know, calling a little bit more than they quote unquote should, well, now you're in a situation where calculating the best exploit is extremely complicated. So it's one of those where we still want to make some adjustments and we still want to make some assumptions and try to factor in, hey, can I exploit this in any way? For instance, if it's someone who calls too often preflop, I might say, okay, well, if I raise, they're going to call. Is that going to create a cascade of extra callers, or am I more likely to go heads up? If I'm more likely to go heads up, then ask the next step questions, right? Are they going to make any clear mistakes going forward? Especially someone who continues too much right this moment and folds too often on the next. That is someone who I'm still in very much of an exploitative land focus against, and is going to be a raise a lot of things on the initial street, continue on the next, and watch them overfold, capture easy profit. So again, it's always easy when you find someone who overfolds, but when they're continuing more often than they should, especially by calling, it can get complicated. So you still don't want to abandon exploitative play and just strictly rely on the charts, but really think about what's going to happen right this moment, not just between that person, but also anyone else who could possibly be left in the hand. How is that going to impact things? In live poker especially, once you get one caller, it's oftentimes you're going to get multiple callers in a spot. So it's one of those where choose hands accordingly and make sure you're not creating SPRs that are completely terrible for your starting hand. Again, it's easy to go overboard and think that you can exploit, and a lot of players take this to the ego level as well. They're like, well, I'm better than this person, and as such, I can just raise whatever the heck I want preflop. And as soon as you start feeling that way, I don't know, I usually suggest backing it up a moment, really thinking about where your edges are coming from. And if you can't verbalize where your edges are coming from against a player, you might want to rethink exactly how big your edge is against that opponent. So all that being said, again, anytime you can find someone who is folding too often, very easy to exploit them, but it's not that you abandon it when they continue, just you want to be thinking that extra step ahead. Being proactive there is really vital, which pretty much ends up bringing us full circle around this thing. If you have information, exploit accordingly preflop. If you don't, and that's oftentimes the case, just stick to your preflop ranges, go forward from there, and focus a lot on your postflop exploits as well. So again, continue looking for exploitative opportunities, preflop and postflop. Don't completely abandon them, but just know it is far tricky, especially to calculate perfect exploits when it comes to preflop. So keep that all in mind. All right, this next question comes from Tony Anthony, who asked the following. I saw your videos about c-betting in the pro membership. In the c-bet and barrel analysis, you say on a board of ace of hearts, ace of spades, three of spades, hero should check back with 8-6 of spades. I get that we need to check weak draws on a lot of boards, but in this situation, why don't we just c-bet our entire range for 1/3 pots? It's easier, and there's no mistakes. So the simplest explanation is that we have a dominated flush draw, and we really want to make sure that we manage the size of the pot accordingly, right? Because we have 8-6 of spades on an ace-ace-3 board with 2 spades, it's one of those where pretty much any flush draw our opponent has is going to be bigger than ours. There's going to be pretty much no flush draws that we dominate other than exactly 4-5, and that's not a particularly great thing for us, particularly on a paired board. So by checking back, what do? Well, it accomplishes the goal of keeping the pot size more manageable. That's great. And it's also very easy to defend when our opponent fires the turn, and that's pretty great as well. So it accomplishes a lot of the goals that we have with a hand similar to this. But the counterpoint to this is that on a board of ace-ace-3, we can probably get an above average amount of fold equity, which means we can probably realize similar EVs by making a small size c-bet here as to just checking here. The issue, though, is that if we're going to make mistakes as that pot gets really big, right, as our mistake propensity goes up in larger size pots, that can be a really big issue for us, and it can skew that similar EV to maybe not being quite as good as just checking back here instead. So again, this is one of those complications when it comes to trying to calculate exploits early on in a hand, just simply because there's a lot more play to be accounted for, everything from implied odds to reverse implied odds to your own mistake propensities to your own ability to maximize value. These are going to be things that are definitely going to be very difficult to calculate this appropriately. So with all that said, the decision in a vacuum probably isn't all that important since everything is so close. but it's 100% worth recapping why we have this thought process around betting our entire range for something like 1/3 pot. So the concept of c-betting 1/3 pot with your entire range is a simplification on GTO strategies. And when you compare the simplification, the 1/3 pot with your entire range compared to a complete GTO range, you actually notice that the loss in EV with the simplification is negligible. It's like very, very, very minute, like super nothing. And as such, the simplification is far simpler than trying to enact a perfect GTO strategy. But at the end of the day, this is still a simplification based on GTO. We're not even talking about exploitative poker right this moment. And the GTO strategy, of course, doesn't look at the strategic kinks that our opponent has in their overall strategy. That's really what exploitative poker is at the end of the day. You're saying, okay, here is a strategic issue in your strategy, and here is how I am going to take advantage of that and exploit you by making some sort of line change or bet size change or whatever it is away from a default or even more GTO approach. So take a simple situation where your opponent is a massive calling station, right? And you're in a situation where you have a value hand on the flop. Well, if you just fire it for 1/3 pot, you're clearly missing out on a tremendous amount of value simply because why just bet 1/3 when they will gladly give, say, a pot size bet just as much action with just as many second best hands when you have that pure value hand, right? If you're looking at this from a purely exploitative point of view, the bigger bet clearly makes a lot more sense. And even in that same exact situation, say you didn't have a value hand, say you had trash, why c-bet your trash for 1/3 pot? Right? They're going to call anyway, so why not trim that stuff out of your range and make your betting range very, very value heavy and very, very big when it comes to the bet size overall. That is a clear way of exploiting your opponent and the issues they have in their strategy rather than just adhering to a, well, I'm going to bet 1/3 pot with my entire range without really thinking about your opponent's tendencies. Again, if you know those tendencies, make sure to factor that in when you're thinking about how do I take really, really good exploitative lines that maximize value against the mistakes that they are likely to make. So if the only thing you take away from this episode is the question you're going to start asking yourself of, is a GTO strategy incentivized here, or are there more profitable exploitative options available? If you ask yourself that question regularly, you're going to be able to discern quickly, hey, should I revert back to more GTO simply because I don't have enough information to deviate accordingly, or is there an exploitative option available that I can take advantage of? Especially if it's quick and easy, single street, maybe a double street kind of exploit, you should definitely be looking for these rather than just saying, I'm going to adhere strictly to GTO and just missing tons of possible win rate potential by looking for more exploitative lines when you have the information available to you. All right, this next question comes from Blind Panda, who asked the following. You mentioned that betting 1/3 with range is likely a mistake. You have to have a default strategy though if you have no reads, and how does one go about building that default strategy, especially when moving up stakes or moving sites where you may not have a good sample size for population analysis? So assuming you have absolutely zero assumptions about anything, yes, it would be best to take a best approximation of a GTO approach and go forward from there. But the issue is that you almost certainly don't have zero assumptions whatsoever. All poker players have some assumptions about what's going on in their player pool and what players are going to do and how things are going to kind of pan out. So this is just kind of baked into the game. And obviously back in the day it was far different, right? We didn't have GTO solvers the way we do today. The player pool analysis was very, very different and much more limited. And all that's happened is through these tools is that we've gotten more refinements, very, very clear ability to analyze the data, and we're able to say, hey, this is actually exactly what's going on in my player pool, or exactly what a GTO approximation looks like against this kind of player, whatever it be. So it's changed a tremendous amount, but assumptions are baked into the game. So if you're going to go, say, move up or take a shot at the next limit or change over to a different room, whatever it be, you should bring your assumptions with you to some extent, simply because there are more similarities in player pools when it comes to kind of general exploits and what players are tending to do. There's more similarities than there are differences, and that's a really, really key thing, especially when you're going from one limit to the next rather than, say, jumping 5 or 6 limits up. There's a lot of similarities there. So you shouldn't just completely abandon your assumptions and abandon all the information that you've gathered by playing. Rather, you should should look to refine it as you get more information, but not just completely abandon it and say, I have nothing, I'm starting from scratch, just because that's simply not going to be the case like 99.99999% of the time, unless you are absolutely brand new to poker. And this is really the kicker that you have to keep in mind when it comes to this question of GTO versus exploitative, is a GTO strategy is best when your opponent is also implementing a GTO strategy. But we're playing against humans. Humans do not implement a perfect GTO strategy. They can try to implement GTO simplifications, they might have some GTO-ish in certain areas, but more often than not, they're not. I mean, poker players as humans, we just can't do that. So if that's the case, we really should be looking for exploitative options and opportunities. So there's kind of a general heuristic that I think is really, really helpful that helps you frame out what should be focused on, what should be your priority in terms of exploitative versus GTO. And here it is in its most simple form. First focus should be villain-specific exploits. That should be based on information, things like HUD stats or any sort of like specific exploration you've done against that opponent. Number 2 are general population exploits, so these are things that you've done based upon population analysis. And then number 3 are GTO strategies. And again, this is when we have zero assumption on what our opponent is doing, and it's just safer to stick to a pure GTO approach than it is to try to get into exploitative and possibly make ourselves very, very exploitable in return. So if you kind of focus on those, if you have information on your opponent specifically or on your player pool, those should be prioritized over just implementing a broad GTO approach. That's going to be far, far better. Might be a little more difficult, might be a little trickier to calculate, especially the exact value of an exploit on earlier streets especially, but that really should be your main overarching focus. So keep that in the back of your mind when you're having this internal conversation about what should I be prioritizing, exploitative or GTO. And by the way, if you're interested in learning more about all of these things, GTO poker, player pool analysis, villain-specific exploits, definitely make sure to upgrade to a pro membership today. Our new Black Friday discount is starting right this moment, redchippoker.com/Black Friday. No spaces, no hyphens, just one word. Jump over there, get 3 months of pro for $99 and really lock in a really good study regimen as you're rounding out 2021 and getting ready for 2022. Get access to everything, our entire pro library, including full access to core, our bet sizing course, the new GTO Plus course as well, as long as a ton of other great stuff. Again, redchippoker.com/Black Friday to jump in and lock in your savings right this moment. And that is going to wrap it up for this episode. Thank you so much for hanging out and listening today. If you have any comments or questions, please don't hesitate to let us know. Again, you can always check us out on the Discord channel. And if you need anything, give us a heads up. And if you're watching this on YouTube, a thumbs up would be great. And a review on your favorite podcast playing app would be wonderful as well. If you need anything, let me know. Otherwise, we'll see you back shortly with a brand new episode. And in the meantime, good luck out there and happy grinding.